Hi, everybody. This is Barbara Schwark from Clear Intentions International, and I want to thank you for being here today. And we're going to talk about imposter syndrome, and I'm all excited to talk about it and sort of disperse some of the myth that imposter syndrome brings with it. So, first of all, I want you to give yourself an opportunity to thank yourself for showing up and making time to be there for yourself because imposter syndrome is something that really impacts many of us, and it shows up in all these different areas in our lives. So thank yourself for being here, and I really hope that you will learn a lot of things. So, imposter syndrome. Um, Ask yourself for a moment, why are you here? What caught your eye? Why are you curious? Is it something that's impacting you at work? Is it something that is impacting your relationships? Are you passing it on? Where does imposter syndrome play a role in your life? For some of us, we can say, I experience this every day in my life. And for some of you, will say, well, sometimes I have a really big assignment and it's a stretch assignment. And I feel like it's so big and I'm not sure that I can accomplish it. And all of a sudden, the imposter shows up and makes me feel smaller. So it can be very tricky. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's lurking behind and we're not even aware of it. And then it shows up. So ask yourself, where does it show up in my life? And is there something where it shows up all the time? Or is it something that just comes up occasionally? So that's the first thing that I want you to think about. And the second thing I want you to think about is, how is it impacting you? What does it cost you to have imposter syndrome? Are you perhaps in your relationships, this is showing up because you're picking partners, or you picked a partner who's not inspiring you or making you feel small? And I'm not saying that that's actually so, but oftentimes how we feel inside and what the reality actually is not the same. So what is it costing you? And perhaps at work, when you're working on a project, it's showing up because you don't feel that the project's ever going to be perfect, and you work on the project and you work on the project, and before you know it, the deadline has passed and you're still working on the project because it's never perfect. So with some of my clients, it shows up because, or it shows up in situations when they're parenting and they don't feel like they're a good mother, or they're not a good father because they also want to have a career, and they feel bad because they are not spending as much time with their children than they think they should. And they feel like an imposter because they want to have it all, or they feel like an imposter as a parent, or at work, or both. So really it shows up in all these different areas, and it's costing us because it often makes us feel depressed. We are anxious. Some people feel aggravated, lost, vulnerable. All these different emotions show up. And when we are experiencing these, let's call them negative emotions, it really is challenging for us to accomplish things because we have this, thing going on the side. So all good reasons for looking at imposter syndrome and seeing what we can do about it. So what is it? What is an imposter syndrome? And I want to tell you that even though it's very popular and the term has been coined, I'm going to say about 30, 40 years ago, it is nothing more but low self-esteem, not feeling good enough, those limiting beliefs that we have about ourselves that all affirm that something is wrong, that we're not perfect, and no matter how hard you try or we try, it's never going to be good enough. So that is basically imposter syndrome. People say that women experience it more than men, but let me tell you, from my experience, when I talk to my clients, it's not so. Really, both men and women in all levels of management experience imposter syndrome. So what else do I want to say about it? Well, imposter syndrome has many different origins. So for some of you, it's learned behavior, maybe something that you've heard or something that was a message that you received when you were younger. And let me give you an example, for instance, and I don't mean this to be in any case, shape or form to rag on my parents, because I think they grew up with the same message, and it's slightly cultural. So if you don't know me, I grew up in Germany, and I recently actually spent 3.5 weeks with my son in Germany, and I visited a lot of the places that where basically I spent my childhood. So I was at my elementary school and the marketplace where we used to play and hang out. And I went by my high school. And for me, my hometown has a lot of those kind of negative experiences, especially around school. So when I was in third grade, I had a teacher who was very tough. She was sort of old school German teacher. And I wasn't very good in reading or writing. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was very dyslexic. And all that was hard for me because slow for me to take, my brain couldn't take in the words, and it was difficult for me to write. And I recall when I was actually in first grade that I looked at the letters that were written above the blackboard, and I thought I will never be able to write these because they seemed so incredible, complicated, and difficult. So in third grade, one of the tasks that we had is we had to write a lot of dictations, and I really worked very hard because in third grade I already had a private tutor who was helping me to get better, and I got really good grades. And I think I had 4 or 5 of those dictations where I received a 2, and so the best result that you can get is a 1, and a 2 is pretty good out of 6. And the teacher decided to, and I had 1 3, so I had maybe 5 2s and 1 3, and the teacher decided to give me a 3. And I didn't really understand it, and I was so upset, and I thought it was so unfair because if you do the math, it's obvious that I had more 2s than a 3, and that I deserved a 3. And her reasoning was that she couldn't move me from a 4 to a 2. That was too much of a leap. And so she said, okay, the compromise was that she wrote in her comments, but sometimes Barbara also is a 2. And right then and there, my experience told me that no matter how hard I try, no matter how many private tutoring sessions I have or will have, it will never be good enough, and it's not fair. And that really followed me for decades. And many, many times when I had to perform, or when I had to read, or when I had to write something, or write an essay, or in school, and even my dissertation, I thought it wasn't good enough, and it wasn't going to be ever good enough. And whatever I was doing in order to achieve, I was an imposter, because if people could really see, and they could really look deep inside, they would see that clearly I wasn't that smart, and I wasn't good enough. So those are stories that perhaps all of you have, and whether it's something that you actually experienced or that you picked up from your parents, or it was culturally something that you received, those are things that contribute to imposter syndrome, because there are negative beliefs that we carry about ourselves, and sometimes we put them down really, really deep, and so that we don't remember them, but they still impact us. So that's one story, and one way that we get impacted, or how we come by imposter syndrome. Another way is through DNA. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because I think it's super interesting to realize and to acknowledge how the DNA of our mothers and grandmothers impact us. So a lot of research has been done around Holocaust and Holocaust survivors, especially in the United States. And it was found out that the trauma gets passed on by at least 2 generations through the DNA. So if there was trauma around worthiness or unworthiness and low self-esteem, regardless of what the situation was, it was passed on by 2 generations. So look at that and look at the implication of that. So my grandmother was, my parents were born right around World War II, and my grandparents were born in the 1910s. And so even though they themselves didn't participate in a sense in World War I, their parents did, and they were little kids. So all of that and all of those experience and all the trauma that it was experienced by all the people that went through that really impacted their self-esteem. So by default, all of us are now impacted that. So this nature of imposter syndrome, we can say we come by it honestly because our parents had imposter syndrome, our grandparents had imposter syndrome, and on and on and on and on. And so here we are generations later, and we're all experiencing that. Now we can say the mistake that we're making or the missed opportunity is that we're not dealing with it, and so that it gets passed on over and over and over and over. So other reasons that we have imposter syndrome, I think, is for some of us it's a big lesson. If you have a spiritual perspective, you can say maybe this is something that your karma, you came in to learn about imposter syndrome and to overcome it in a way that brings more loving and more light and more joy into your life. So what can we do? What can we do about imposter syndrome? Actually, let me go back. I want to talk about how it shows up and the different ways it shows up so that you can get a little bit of a better understanding of how it might show up for you. So there's a couple of different ways that imposter syndrome shows up. And one of them is this notion as that we call Superman and Superwoman. This is the kind of person that people that push themselves really, really hard. They like to be the hero. They like to be the savior. And all of this is in service to avoid feeling bad about themselves or to experience low self-esteem. They constantly go the extra mile, and they make sure that the mission is accomplished. So these will be the people that stay up 24/7, and they work all the time. And it's important for them to stay busy, because if they're not busy, then something is missing, or they start to question themselves. Did I do enough? Or did I work hard enough? Is this mission really going to be at the level where it needed to be? If they fail, they are going to be super stressed, because they are actually no longer the superhero. They're not saving the mission. So at work, I think this is pretty obvious, but this is also, you can see this in people's personal life. These are the people that always volunteer, and they have to save the day by, accomplishing the projects, always waving their hands when there's a volunteer needed. So it's not just at work where it shows up. The second way this shows up is what we call the loner. And the loner is somebody who does everything themselves. They don't ask for help. They need to accomplish everything themselves, because if somebody else joins their mission or their team, they might be found out, meaning the other people might ask questions, and it might be pretty obvious that they don't know what they're doing, or at least that they're afraid that they might be found out. So the main point here is that the loner is always afraid of being exposed. The third one is the expert. The expert is someone who needs to learn. They need to study all the time. They're hungry for information, and they will spend a lot of time researching, and they might never get the project completed because they're still researching. Also, this is a little bit in service of not wanting to make a mistake. So a lot of these, different ways, what they have in common is that people want to make sure that they are not being found out. So they need to know everything. They, if the task is outside their scope or their knowledge, they usually feel stupid because they don't understand what it's all about, and they're maybe is not the time for them to get up to speed. So it's easy for them to get triggered because they don't have all the information. Their ego is easily shaken and they fall off the wagon if that's the case. The next one would be the perfectionist. And you could say that the perfectionist, like I mentioned in the beginning already, can be found in many of the different, the different personas that I'm describing. So I think the perfectionist, however, is most concerned with everything being perfect. And there are no exceptions. So it can't be just, they can't color a little bit outside the line, or they can't allow themselves to have a little mistake. It's all or nothing. So once you mess up somehow, you have to start over. So you can see that in children sometimes when they draw something and it's not perfect and they have to start over and they can't fix something. So it's not okay to use an eraser or to come up with a different drawing, or create something new because it's not perfect. So we have to start over and we have to throw it away. My son's a little bit like that sometimes, and one of the things that I'm teaching him is to be creative and to perhaps use that mistake or that unintended outcome and to come up with something new. So, and for those of you who have children that way, or even when you see somebody else being that way, perhaps you can challenge yourself and see, hey, how can I use that to my advantage? And just to continue a little bit with that, Edison, the guy who invented the light bulb, made thousands and thousands of mistakes until he came up with the light bulb, and aren't we glad that he did? Number 5 would be the genius. This is the guy or the gal who knows everything. They're just so incredibly smart that everything comes easy to them. However, when they find themselves in a new environment where things are no longer easy, they also fall off the wagon, and all of a sudden they ask themselves, am I really that smart? Maybe I'm not. So this is often the case with folks who, maybe they were the number one, they were valedictorian, and then they go to Harvard and they find out that everybody's that smart. Or people who are coming into a new profession, or they are starting to work for a different company and everybody's super smart, and they no longer feel special that way, and they're no longer the genius because everybody is at their level, or perhaps even smarter. So those are some of the ways that it can show up. So we have the Superman, Superwoman, we have the loner, we have the expert, we have the perfectionist, and we have the genius. So, and there might probably be other ways that it shows up. And you can, but by the way, feel free to write in the comments if you have a question. If you want me to talk about something specifically. So there might be other ways where this shows up, and oftentimes it's a combination. And sometimes one particular thing shows up in one situation and another persona shows up in other situations. So let's talk about the sort of important part of tonight, and that is, what can we do about it? How can we overcome imposter syndrome, and so that we can have more freedom, more joy, more excitement in our lives, which is what we want, and that's what I would want for you. So first of all, the most important thing that you can do right off the bat is to recognize that this is normal. I told you in the beginning, everybody suffers from imposter syndrome because all of us come by it honestly because of our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents had some imposter syndrome, their self-esteem wasn't as great. And so obviously, we have some of that as well. And if you look at the flip side, people that are seen as very proud and very strong and full of self-esteem, and they're often labeled with, you're egotistical and you're narcissist and those kind of things as well. So our society really supports people to have a little bit of an imposter syndrome. So it's normal. Everybody has it. And what is really important about that is what you do with it and how you handle yourself and what your commitment to yourself is. And if you want to, not experience it at all, or if you want to learn how to deal with it when it shows up. So that's one. Number two is when you feel imposter syndrome, and it sort of goes with the first point, realize that a lot of times what's happening is that your brain is responding, and particularly the reptilian brain, and the reptilian brain is doing fight, flight, or freeze. So if you know something about the way our brain functions or neuroscience, you know that every human being, we have three parts of the brain. We have the intellectual part, we have the emotional part, and we have the reptilian brain, which is the fight, flight, or freeze. So the brain controls everything about us, everything, our muscle movement, why you're here tonight, and why this is important, why you fell in love, why you're wearing what you're wearing, everything, breathing, everything comes and is connected to the brain. Now, when we look at the brain in this simple way, you will realize really quickly that imposter syndrome is not something that comes from the intellect. It really comes from the limbic, the emotional, and the reptilian part of the brain. The neocortex is the only part of the brain that is conscious. The neocortex is the part of the brain that produces, and I'm saying producing because it's all biochemical, where the language is being produced, you're listening, anything that has to do with intellect comes from the neocortex. And for the scientists who are listening, I know I'm simplifying, but I like to simplify things because in some way it makes it easier for us to understand and actually do something with the information. So neocortex, smart part of the brain, language, listening, anything that has to do with analytics. We supposedly can control this part of the brain, and you know how hard it is to control what comes out of your mouth, and our thoughts are difficult to control as well. The limbic system is the part of the emotion that produces, it's part of the brain that produces emotions. Emotions are also biochemical, so meaning we can't control them, and they're automatic, and they are responses to a situation. So when you are experiencing something that's challenging and you're being triggered, the emotions are coming up. So if you're at work and you're being presented with a project that is challenging for you, then you have an automatic emotion about it. And later you might go into your neocortex and rationalize about what it is that you experienced. And most likely you will come up with, if it was low self-esteem, oh, I have imposter syndrome, or maybe I'm struggling with imposter syndrome. So the limbic is the part of the brain that does the emotions, and it's subconscious, meaning we can't really access it that well. We can, but it's a little bit more difficult. And then we have the reptilian part of the brain, and the reptilian part of the brain is the fight, flight, or freeze, and it's really unconscious because we like to keep all the stuff that we don't want to remember deep in our consciousness. So, it was for many years that I didn't remember that. I had those bad experience with my teacher in third grade, and I didn't really understand why I was having this sort of visceral response in school, or when I would see red marks all over my paper. It's because of my reptilian brain. It was doing fight, flight, or freeze, meaning it was either playing dead, I was running away, or I was trying to fight. And if you watch yourself, you can see that you have a tendency to do one more than the other. So people tend to either be a fighter, or they they tend to play dead, or they tend to run away. And if you look towards nature, you can see that all of those things are very well represented in nature. So fight, flight, or freeze. So imposter syndrome really is something that's connected to that when you're triggered in a situation, you're feeling, you might feel frozen. And then your brain goes, oh, what just happened to me? I have to understand this, and I'm going to rationalize about it. And it's going to come up with something, and that something might be imposter syndrome. So all to support my point that we all have it, we all experience it, and it's perfectly normal. And it's even something that is habitual to the way that your brain is set up or programmed. So what else can we do? Well, I'm big on number 2, and I'm going to tell you what it is. Number 2 is to love yourself. And loving ourselves is not an easy task. It's simple, but it's not necessarily easy. And what I mean by that is that when you feel like an imposter, or you feel insecure, or whatever is showing up in your day or in your world around the different roles that you play, or wherever you are, love yourself. Be okay with it. Embrace yourself. So, when I used to feel like an imposter, and I want to say, sometimes I still do, I used to really judge myself, and I used to be very critical. And on top of me feeling bad already about a particular situation, I used to then beat myself up and say, oh, you should have done better, and why you're not listening, and what's going on, and why aren't you doing better, or why are there all these red marks on the paper? And so it's like, on top of feeling bad already, I was making myself feel worse. So when you're feeling bad about yourself, and you feel like you're not good enough, and you're an imposter, and how come that people don't see it, and if they only knew, love yourself and embrace yourself with all that you have. And if you don't know how to do that with yourself, there's a couple ways that I'm going to suggest to you that you can. One of them is you can acknowledge yourself for the things that you did do well. Acknowledging is a skill that I learned in coaching, and it is to look into the past and to specifically mention the skills that you used, or perhaps a way of being that you showed up in order to make something happen. So let's say if I wanted to acknowledge myself for taking my son to Germany for 3.5 weeks, I would say, I acknowledge myself for taking my son to Germany for the first time for 3.5 weeks. And I acknowledge my courage, I acknowledge my creativity, and I acknowledge my big and generous heart, and my willingness to let go of the outcome and just be surprised and amazed. So that is how I would acknowledge myself. And acknowledgement is often something that we recommend that a manager, or perhaps a mother, does with her child, or a manager does with his direct reports. But I find that it's super powerful when you do it with yourself, because it's a way of loving yourself. It's a way of seeing yourself. It's a way of really saying, hey, I see you, and what you're doing and how you are and how you're being is inherently good. So it's very powerful, and I recommend that we do it once a day, and you can schedule it into your busy day. It only takes about 5, 10, 20 seconds, and you can start today. Another way of loving yourself is to champion yourself. And championing is the same thing, but it's about the future. So I acknowledge myself about something that I did. And championing would be about something that's coming up that I feel, perhaps a little challenged, or I'm afraid, or, I have imposter syndrome. I'm, worried that people are going to find out that I don't know really what I'm talking about. And I would also look at the skills, and I look at the things that I know about myself. I know certain skills. I know that I'm creative. I know that I have courage. I know that that I'm a good planner. I know that I'm strategic. I know that I'm smart. And so those are the things that I could use to champion myself. So if I would champion myself next week, perhaps some of you know this already, I'm going to do a 3-day strategic planning challenge. It's going to be 3 days in a row for 1 hour. And I would champion myself and say, hey, Barbara, I'm going to champion you because I know that you're very passionate about this topic and that you really have good knowledge about planning and goal setting, and that you're clear about intentions and methods and goals, and that you know how to inspire people, and that you love this work, and that you're committed to making a difference. So that's how I would champion myself. And just by doing this for 10 seconds, I feel good, I'm excited, and whatever worries I might have kind of are gone for the moment because I'm more present to who I am and the skills that I have. So those are 2 things that you can do in order to love yourself and love yourself more. And you can also do things like do nice things like have a cup of tea, or take yourself to the movies, or schedule some quiet time. Those are all things that for me are very loving. Or go on a trip, or have a nice dinner with your husband or your wife or your spouse, or get together with some friends. So do some things that are loving and talk to yourself in loving ways. Number 3, this is a very fun way to deal with imposter syndrome. So I was inspired actually to talk about this today because I had this conversation with a client who's about to have a big meeting tomorrow, a big board meeting where the company is going to be restructured. And the person was feeling like an imposter. It's like, I can't do it, and I'm not a manager, and I don't know, and I've never been, and really like, who am I? On and on and on and on. And I was asking this person if they knew how to ski. And they said yes. And I said, are you any good? And they said, I'm very good. And I said, well, you know how to ski on a double black diamond when it's not your best day? And they said, yes, I take wider turns, and I stop, and I check out the terrain, and I know exactly what to do. And I said, imagine yourself taking these skills when you're feeling challenged and you don't know what to do into the board meeting tomorrow, and see how that feels. And they were incredibly energized, and the adrenaline came back up. And all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, I know exactly what to do. And if somebody's asking me a question and I don't know the answer and I have to think about it, I'll be like on the slopes. I'll stop and I look at the terrain, and I'll look, should I take a left or a right, or should I stop, or maybe I should go down a different slope. So what I'm telling you here is to look at a different area in your life, something where you have mastery, and transfer that mastery into this new thing. You maybe are going outside your comfort zone because there's something that you've never done before. And you can bring to mind a different situation where you did that. Oh, I've never done this before. Because what the brain does, it goes into the past and it looks at situations and says, have I done this? Have I done a similar situation? And did I solve this in a positive way? And if the brain says, yes, I did it, and I did it in a positive way, it brings calmness to you. So you can trick your brain into looking at a different area and creating that bridge, and you'll immediately feel strong and certain and confident about yourself, and you'll be able to handle the situation better because the heart rate is down, and when our parasympathetic nervous system is calmer, our creativity is better, we can hear better, our senses are stronger, and we'll be more creative, and we'll show up, and the outcomes will be better because of the way we show up. Number 5. So I talk a lot about this when I am talking with my clients, and that's this whole idea of the gremlin. There's a book that was written by Richard Carson. It's called Taming Your Gremlin. We read about it in coaching school. And the whole book is about this. It's not about imposter syndrome, but it's about the gremlin and the purpose of the gremlin. And the purpose of the gremlin and I'm calling a gremlin, that little voice inside your head that goes, "Oh, you can't do it," and "You're not good enough," and all the different ways the imposter syndrome shows up. And in the book, the author gives a few suggestions on how to deal with the gremlin, and I'm going to mention a few to you. And the first one I want to mention is observing the gremlin. So one of the things that will happen is that you have this challenging assignment, and all of a sudden the imposter syndrome will come upon you, and you will want to act on it, meaning you don't want to do, or you are frozen. But what I'm suggesting to you is that you observe yourself, and you can see that sort of on the side, and you can still move forward because you're just observing the imposter. "Hi, imposter, I see you. I see you, being in full force." And sometimes it's hard because the imposter is kind of really having a stronghold on us, and we're not able to move forward. But it's not always the case. And so sometimes you can observe it and love it and just move forward anyway. Another way, and this is not written in the book, it's actually something that I came up with, is you can give your gremlin a different job. So instead of telling yourself that you're no good and you can't and whatnot, you can ask the gremlin to use that energy towards something else. So I asked my gremlin to be an explorer and to help me conquer things, and to be creative, and to help myself come up with new solutions. And it's really worked well in that when I find myself in a new situation that I know I can manage, even when the imposter wants to show up. So a recent story of that is when we were in Germany and we had taken the train for 6 hours, my son and I, to visit friends. It turned out that as soon as they picked us up from the train station, we had a flat tire. It's Sunday. We are in a quiet part, and in Germany, on Sunday, everything's shut down. And my friend had a new car, and this new car didn't have a spare. And I was not familiar with the fact that cars don't have spares. I just knew that was a possibility. So she had a spare, and she didn't really know what to do. And her imposter was showing up, and the imposter was showing up, it's like, "I'm helpless, I don't know." And my imposter showed up as, "Oh, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to observe my imposter and do it anyway." So we had to figure out how to get those tire filled up with air. And to make a long story short, we were able to, but I really asked my gremlin to help me and to be courageous, and we were, because we had to figure out, we keep the nail, and we had to use a compressor to put some sort of chemical into the tire to blow it up. All to tell you that it worked out, but the short end of the story is that use your gremlin and assign him or her or it a new task and see how it can support you. What else do I want to talk about? Pep Talks. So Pep Talks is definitely a very, very important skill that I use. And Pep Talks help me. So when I find myself in a difficult situation and I'm nervous, I tell myself, I use positive affirmation. So you can call it pep talk, you can call it positive affirmation, but it's a way for me to remind myself in a different way than the acknowledgement or challenge or the championing of who I am and what I've done and that I'm capable, and to make that more present than anything else. Last but not least, I want to talk about beliefs. So if you're really interested in sort of removing or eliminating the imposter syndrome and where it comes from, you need to be willing to dig deep. That means you need to be willing to look at your negative beliefs, because it's all based on negative beliefs. Some part of you, either conscious or subconscious or unconscious, telling yourself that you can't do it. And oftentimes we can't even hear our limiting beliefs because we're so ingrained to it. So when people come to me, I listen and I point it out to them, and because in their world it's already impossible because they've already limited themselves. And some of you know this, but some of you don't know this. I use muscle testing and something called neuroemotional coaching to identify these limiting beliefs and then to neutralize them, and so that there's space for us to put in positive beliefs such as I am good enough, or I am able, or I am worthy, or I deserve, or I can, and I want, and I am. So all those things that are blocking us from really getting and having and creating the amazing life that we want in all those areas are really a function of the limiting beliefs. And imposter syndrome is just one big giant limiting belief. So if you don't want to have this in your life, you actually can get rid of it and neutralize it. And it's a process. So it's not just one of those, hey, I'm waking up tomorrow and I am, rewiring myself and neutralizing one limiting beliefs, and therefore I have no more imposter syndrome. Depending on how ingrained it is and how long you've been carrying it around with you and what prior work you've done, it takes a little bit of consistent work to do it, but it's possible. And it's really amazing to see what's happening when people are neutralizing it and freeing themselves and really stepping into who they are and their incredible creativity or magnificence. So it's something that I'm very passionate about. If you're interested in it, I offer 3 months program on it. You're very welcome to go to my website, clearintentions.net, and schedule a free introductory session. I'm really, really thrilled to share with you about it, and you can explore if this is something that you would want to try out for yourself. So for me, because I've worked in this way, somebody worked with me this way for many, many years, I attribute my entire change of life to changing and working and neutralizing my beliefs. I am no longer the person that I was when I started this work, and I'm entirely grateful for it. So I highly recommend that you consider it. All right, so what else do I want to talk about? Let's do a little bit of a recap. We talked about imposter syndrome, what it is, how it's impacting us, and how it shows up in those 5 different ways. And then I give you a bunch of tips on what you can do in order to deal with it, such as loving yourself, acknowledging yourself, championing yourself, reframing it, working with your gremlin, looking at Pep Talks, affirmations, and also transferring skills that you have in an area where you feel confident into the area that you're working on. And so last but not least, one thing I want to talk about is forgiveness. So if all fails and none of those things are working for you, and this is true for myself as well, if I find myself sort of in a spot where it's really difficult, I move towards forgiveness. Forgiveness is a tool that's very powerful because on a biochemical level, it's a way of release. And if you're a spiritual person, then forgiveness has a particular place perhaps in your life. But if you're not spiritual, you can use it just as well. So forgiveness I use when I am judging myself, and judgment shows up when there's imposter and I'm not good enough and I'm not working hard enough and I'm about to be found out, and all of those conversations I might have in my head. And the statements that I use, and I got this from the University of Santa Monica, is I forgive myself for judging myself, ... And then I am specifically talking about what it is that I'm judging, really. And the deeper you go, the better. And the other phrase is I forgive myself for judging, and this could be a person or situation, circumstance, and then I go as deeply as I can. So it might be, an example might be, I forgive myself for judging myself for not practicing what I preach and not feeling good enough to complete this task. Or I forgive myself for judging myself as imperfect. And, no matter how hard I work, for not being able to get and deliver a perfect project. And so you know what your judgments are. And this exercise allows you to get it out loud, to be present to it, and to take it from the depth of your consciousness and to bring it forward and to put some light on it and lightness, and then to let it go. So it's really meant as a release technique. And one of the powerful techniques that I was taught also a long time ago, I'm not sure where I heard this, is it's a really beautiful process if you can review your day and you can sort of look and see what are the things that you're proud of, and maybe you want to acknowledge those things. And then you can look towards the future and see, are there some challenges, and you can champion yourself. And then you can look towards the things that didn't go so well, and you can forgive yourself for that. And then when you go to sleep and when you put your head on the pillow, you kind of like brought neutrality and balance and positivity to your day. So that's something that you might want to play with and see how that works for you. And if you do, with all those things, I recommend that you chart yourself, meaning that when you start this process, maybe on a scale from 0 to 3, take a look and see how you're feeling on a day-to-day basis. Are you experiencing imposter syndrome? Do you feel low self-esteem? And then when you are practicing a skill, then check yourself a week or two, ideally a month later, and then see how you feel. Because when we're working on these things, what matters is that you are using the tools that really work for you. And the only way that we can identify those is if we actually measure them. And we have a start, a beginning and an end. So I'm a big fan of tracking, and you can do this very easily. And you can practice, a different skill for a month, and you can see if that works. And then if you got great results, maybe add something, or if you didn't get great results, change it to something else. So that's basically what I have for you tonight. And if you're looking for more information on any of those things that I mentioned, feel free to contact me. It's easy to reach out on LinkedIn, or you can go to my website, clearintentions.net. I also have a weekly YouTube video that I do where I talk about different skills, or I give some tips, or I talk about different issues for about 6 to 7 minutes. I invite you to check out the channel. If you do, it's great. If you can like the channel, and if you can like the videos, all those things really help me. And I have a newsletter. This may be how some of you found out about tonight. You're welcome to subscribe. And really, I'm here for you, and I want to support you. And if any of this is of interest to you, just let me know. So with that, thank you so much for showing up tonight, and or afternoon. Have a great rest of the day, and I see you soon. Take care.